The day had started like any other for Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams. He had just finished a series of important meetings at the Pentagon, where his dedication to the Army had earned him respect and admiration. As an Army officer, Marcus had built a career focused on discipline, leadership, and above all, honor. His reputation was untarnished, and he was known for being calm under pressure, always ready to serve his country. After a long and tiring day, Marcus decided to head home, looking forward to spending time with his family and enjoying a quiet evening. He was driving through a peaceful suburban neighborhood, a few miles away from the heart of the city. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden light over the streets. The world outside his car seemed calm, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of decisions he had faced earlier in the day at work. His mind was still on the discussions about national security and military strategy, but now he allowed himself a few moments to unwind. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. Marcus knew the area well, having driven through it countless times. As he cruised along, he didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. But then, the flashing lights of a police car appeared in his rearview mirror, a stark reminder of how quickly life could change. Marcus wasn't in a hurry. He had nothing to hide. So he simply slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, keeping his hands on the steering wheel as he had been trained to do in countless safety briefings. His mind wasn't on the traffic stop. It was on the relaxing evening ahead. However, as the police car came to a stop behind him, he couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. It wasn't a feeling he often experienced, but something about the way the officer approached his vehicle felt off. The officer, a man named Officer John Harris, stepped out of the car and approached Marcus's window. From the moment he made contact, it was clear something was wrong. Officer Harris wasn't smiling. He wasn't being polite, as police officers often are during routine stops. Instead, he seemed tense, his body language rigid as he walked up to the car. As he got closer, Marcus noticed something in the officer's eyes, a hint of suspicion that didn't make sense. "License and registration," Officer Harris said coldly, without even offering a greeting. Marcus, though surprised by the officer's tone, remained calm. He reached for his wallet and pulled out his ID, then handed it to the officer, as he had done countless times before in his life. "Here you go, officer," Marcus replied politely. Officer Harris glanced at the identification and then looked back at Marcus, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see something more than what was obvious. "What's your business around here?" the officer asked, his voice sharp, even though Marcus had done nothing wrong. "I'm just heading home after a long day at work," Marcus explained, trying to sound reassuring, but the officer wasn't convinced. There was something about Marcus's uniform and presence that seemed to irritate him more than it should. It was obvious that Officer Harris had already made up his mind about Marcus. But why? The officer took a step back and scrutinized Marcus further. His eyes traveled across Marcus's face down to the military uniform he wore, and then back up. There was an uncomfortable pause, the air thick with unspoken tension. Marcus didn't understand what was happening. He had been stopped by police many times before, but there had always been professionalism and respect. This time, however, it felt different. "Where exactly are you coming from, Colonel?" Officer Harris pressed, his voice becoming even more suspicious. "I told you I was at the Pentagon," Marcus replied, trying to maintain his composure. He was beginning to feel like the officer didn't believe him, or worse, that he was being treated differently because of his rank or appearance. The situation seemed to escalate with every passing second. Officer Harris took a few steps back, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus and his patrol car. Marcus could tell the officer was waiting for something. Maybe a wrong move. Maybe just an excuse to take things further. What started as a routine traffic stop was now turning into something much more uncomfortable. Without warning, Officer Harris suddenly ordered, "Step out of the car now." Marcus blinked in surprise. This wasn't normal. He had done nothing to warrant being ordered out of his vehicle. In his years of experience, even as a decorated officer in the military, he had never been in a situation quite like this one. "Excuse me, officer," Marcus said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. Is there something wrong? I've done nothing illegal. I'm just trying to get home. But Officer Harris didn't respond. He stood there for a moment, staring at Marcus with a look of suspicion, as if he was waiting for him to make a move. Finally, the officer's hand moved to his holster, and Marcus instinctively tensed. "Out of the car!" Officer Harris shouted this time, his voice harsh and commanding. At that moment, something in Marcus snapped. The officer's voice and actions had crossed a line. In all his years serving the military, Marcus had been trained to deal with tense situations. He had de-escalated countless confrontations, both in the field and in the boardroom. But nothing had prepared him for a situation like this. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm, "I am a United States Army officer. I am not a criminal. I do not need to be treated this way." His words only seemed to enrage the officer more. In a split second, without any warning, Officer Harris pulled out his firearm and aimed it at Marcus. "Don't make me tell you again," Officer Harris growled. Marcus's heart raced as he instinctively pressed himself back into his seat, his hand still raised on the steering wheel. He had no idea what was happening. How had this simple traffic stop turned into a life-threatening situation? The next few moments passed in a blur. The officer's finger was on the trigger, and Marcus could feel the tension in the air like a storm about to break. Without any reason, the officer fired a shot. The bullet struck Marcus in the chest, and the world around him began to spin. The pain was immediate and intense, but Marcus fought to stay conscious. His vision blurred, but he knew he had to survive. He had to make it through this. As the officer stood there, gun still in hand, Marcus's mind raced. What had just happened? Why had this officer decided to shoot him? His body felt heavy, and he could feel the blood soaking through his uniform. The pain was unbearable, but somehow he remained awake, holding on to life by sheer will. It was in that moment, lying in his car, that Marcus realized how fragile everything was, how quickly a peaceful evening could be turned upside down by a single careless decision. He couldn't understand it, but he knew one thing. The shooting would change everything. And so, the first chapter of this story ended with Marcus, a decorated military officer, fighting for his life, unaware of how his actions, his identity, and his service would soon spark a firestorm that would echo throughout the country. The world felt like it had stopped for a moment. The sound of Marcus's heartbeat was deafening in his ears, drowning out everything else. His vision was blurry, and his body felt heavier with each passing second. The pain in his chest was sharp and unrelenting, but he could still hear the distant screech of tires as the police officer's vehicle sped away from the scene. His life hung by a thread, and everything was unclear. Minutes felt like hours. His head began to swim as he struggled to stay conscious. He had to survive. He had to make it out of this alive. Marcus focused on his breathing, forcing himself to stay calm despite the overwhelming pain. His thoughts drifted in and out of focus, but somewhere deep inside he knew this moment would change everything. Meanwhile, the officer, who had shot him, had already vanished from the scene. The officer had left the wounded lieutenant colonel, alone, his actions reckless and driven by something darker than the law itself. But Marcus wasn't the only one affected by what had happened. Far from it. News of the incident spread quickly. The moment the ambulance arrived at the scene, the local authorities and emergency responders rushed to stabilize Marcus's condition. They managed to get him to a nearby hospital, where doctors fought desperately to save his life. His injuries were grave, but he was strong, stronger than anyone expected. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that he would pull through, though no one could say for sure just yet. In the waiting rooms, people were already beginning to react. News outlets had picked up the story, and the outrage was palpable. It wasn't just the usual sense of disbelief after such a violent act. It was something more. Marcus was not just any civilian. He was a high-ranking officer in the United States Army, a man who had dedicated his life to service. His shooting wasn't a random act of violence. It was a targeted attack on someone who represented the very institution of law and order. Across India, the country, people were watching. The public couldn't make sense of what had happened. Why would a police officer shoot a man like Marcus, a decorated military officer with an impeccable record? The more people learned about the shooting, the angrier they became. The anger wasn't just about the act itself. It was about the injustice, the feeling that something so senseless and wrong could happen without consequence. As news spread about Marcus's critical condition, the military, the Pentagon, and the wider government were quickly alerted. The response was swift. Military leaders were outraged. They couldn't fathom how someone in law enforcement could target a man who had dedicated his life to the service of his country. There were immediate discussions within the Pentagon about how to handle the situation, and a sense of unity was felt among military personnel who all shared a deep sense of injustice. The Pentagon's reaction was as strong as it was quick. Statements were issued almost immediately, condemning the police officer's actions. Marcus's name was being spoken with respect, not just by those who knew him personally, but by a larger community of military and government officials who stood behind him. As the story developed, the Pentagon made it clear that they would not tolerate this kind of violence against one of their own. They demanded a full investigation and pledged their full support to Marcus and his family. But not everyone was convinced that justice would be done. In fact, many people feared the worst, that the police officer would be shielded by his colleagues, that his actions would be swept under the rug, and that no one would be held accountable for the shooting. This fear quickly turned to frustration. The more details that emerged about the officer involved, the more unsettling the situation became. Officer John Harris, it turned out, had a history of complaints. He wasn't new to controversy. People began to uncover troubling reports about Officer Harris. It came to light that he had previously been involved in several incidents where he had acted aggressively towards civilians, particularly people of color. His record was filled with complaints about excessive use of force, though none of them had resulted in any major disciplinary action. This revelation fueled the fire of public outrage. Was this just another case of a person in power using their position to avoid the consequences of their actions? Was this another instance of systemic issues in law enforcement? The community began to mobilize. Protesters took to the streets chanting for justice. They demanded that the officer be arrested, that he face charges, and that he be held accountable for what he had done. But it wasn't just about the officer anymore. People were marching for something larger, something deeper. They were marching for justice, for equality, for the belief that no one, regardless of their background, should be treated unfairly by those in positions of authority. Meanwhile, Marcus's family and close friends gathered at the hospital. They held their breath as doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. They were scared, of course, but they also knew Marcus. They knew his strength. They knew the kind of man he was, and they had faith that he would fight through this. The media coverage only added to the pressure. Every time a news anchor mentioned Marcus's name, it was accompanied by a flood of commentary about the officer involved, the history of police brutality, and the questions surrounding law enforcement. Every new piece of information that surfaced brought more outrage, more confusion, and more uncertainty. People were asking questions that didn't have easy answers. Why had Officer Harris acted this way? Was he racially motivated? What was the role of the police department in covering up his past? The families and the general public were not the only ones calling for answers. The military's response was swift and forceful. Top-ranking officials demanded full cooperation from local law enforcement, urging them to conduct a thorough investigation. The Pentagon made it clear that they would not stand idly by, while one of their own was the victim of an unjust shooting. As the investigation progressed, the local police department found themselves under intense scrutiny. They were forced to address the public outcry, and tensions began to rise within the law enforcement community. Officers who had once been colleagues with Harris started to distance themselves from him, and the department's reputation was tarnished. But the story wasn't over yet. There was still much to be uncovered. And while the investigation was ongoing, Marcus's condition was starting to improve. He had managed to survive the worst, though his road to recovery was long and uncertain. What was clear, however, was that his story had sparked something much larger than just one isolated incident. It was a story that was going to change the way people looked at law enforcement, race, and justice. But the questions were only beginning. What would happen next? Would justice prevail? And how would Marcus, the man who had been shot in the prime of his life, emerge from this unimaginable ordeal? As Marcus slowly regained his strength, the world outside continued to watch, waiting for the next chapter in this story, a story that would shake the very foundations of what people thought they knew about law, power, and justice. The investigation into the shooting of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams was no longer just a local matter. It had grown into a national issue, sparking debates that spread across communities, newsrooms, and even government offices. The country was in shock. A respected military officer had been shot during a routine traffic stop by a police officer with a questionable history. People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. The local police department, under increasing pressure, had no choice but to start a thorough investigation. They promised the public that they would leave no stone unturned. However, there was a growing sense of distrust among the public, especially as more details about Officer John Harris emerged. Marcus wasn't the first person to have had problems with the officer. In fact, over the years, Harris had received several complaints regarding his behavior. Complaints about aggression, excessive force, and a tendency to target individuals. He seemed to suspect for reasons unrelated to actual crimes. Many of the complaints had been quietly dismissed. Harris had always seemed to slip through the cracks despite his troubling history. But this time it was different. Marcus was a military officer, and his shooting wasn't something that could be easily ignored or swept under the rug. His position in the military brought a level of attention to the case that could not be avoided. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Officer Harris had been involved in several confrontations with civilians, many of whom had filed complaints. Some of these complaints were about racially motivated actions, while others involved the use of force in situations where it wasn't warranted. Despite these complaints, Harris had remained on the job, receiving only minor reprimands that barely affected his career. It was becoming clear that this was a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked for far too long. The more information that surfaced about Harris, the more frustrated the public became. How could someone with such a history still be on the force? How had his behavior been allowed to continue unchecked? People were beginning to connect the dots, and the growing sense of injustice was palpable. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It was about the systemic problems that allowed officers like Harris to continue in their roles without proper consequences. At the same time, the military was watching closely. The Pentagon had already issued statements condemning the officer's actions, but now they were pushing for more. They demanded that the local authorities provide a thorough and unbiased investigation. In addition to the local police force, the federal government was now involved, bringing more resources to the case in an effort to ensure fairness. The military leaders knew that this wasn't just a matter of one man's life. It was a matter of maintaining the integrity of both the military and law enforcement. The Pentagon had made it clear that they expected justice to be served. Marcus was not just a soldier. He was a symbol of what the country stood for. His shooting had touched a nerve in the military and civilian communities alike. It wasn't just about the pain and suffering Marcus had endured. It was about the wider issues of racial prejudice, police brutality, and the accountability of those in power. Behind the scenes, the pressure on local law enforcement was immense. Police departments across the country were watching this case carefully, knowing that the outcome could set a precedent for how future cases of police misconduct would be handled. There were calls for reforms, for better training, and for a more transparent approach to dealing with police officers who had a history of misconduct. People were demanding that something be done, not just to hold Officer Harris accountable, but to address the larger issues within the system that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked. As the days passed, the tension in the community grew. Protests continued to spread, with people marching in the streets holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Brutality." These protests were different, though. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about a larger, systemic problem that had gone on for far too long. People were tired of hearing about these kinds of stories. tired of seeing the same patterns of behavior repeated over and over again, without any real change. The military also became a strong voice in the ongoing conversation. High-ranking officers, including some of Marcus's closest colleagues, spoke out about the need for justice and reform. They reminded the public that Marcus had devoted his life to serving the country, and they emphasized that his shooting wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on everything the military stood for. They wanted to make sure that this case would not be swept under the rug, and they made it clear that they were watching closely, expecting justice to be served. As the investigation continued, the case began to move toward the courtroom. The first step was to determine whether Officer Harris would be charged with any crimes. His lawyers argued that the shooting had been a mistake, that Harris had acted out of fear for his life, but the evidence against him was mounting. The dash cam footage from the police cruiser, which had been released to the public, showed that Marcus had done nothing to provoke the officer. He had been calm, cooperative, and even polite. The officer, on the other hand, appeared increasingly aggressive, and it was clear that he had made a snap judgment based on racial bias rather than evidence. The public had a difficult time accepting the argument that Officer Harris had acted out of fear. They saw the footage, and it only made them more certain that this wasn't a case of self-defense. It was a case of an officer abusing his power, allowing his prejudices to influence his actions in a dangerous and unlawful way. The mounting evidence created a wave of support for Marcus and his family, with more and more people rallying behind them, demanding justice. But despite the growing public outcry, there was still the question of how this would play out in the courts. Would Officer Harris be held accountable for his actions? Would the legal system finally deliver the justice that so many people were calling for? The stakes had never been higher. The outcome of this case would set a precedent for how future cases of police misconduct were handled across the country. The legal battle would not be an easy one. Officer Harris had many supporters in the law enforcement community, and there were still those who believed that he had acted within his rights. These supporters argued that officers faced dangerous situations every day, and that it was easy to make a mistake under pressure. They pointed to Harris's years of service and his reputation as a tough officer, hoping to shift the focus away from his behavior and onto the situation at hand. However, as the investigation continued to unfold, the tide began to turn. It became increasingly clear that Harris had been given too many chances, that his past actions should have been taken into account long before the shooting of Marcus. People were no longer willing to let his history be overlooked. They were no longer willing to accept the idea that someone with a track record of violence and prejudice could continue to hold a position of power. The courtroom drama was about to begin, but one thing was already clear. This case would change the way people viewed law enforcement and justice in America. No longer could police officers be allowed to act without accountability. No longer could they be allowed to hide behind their badges and avoid the consequences of their actions. As the investigation moved toward the legal phase, the pressure on the legal system was immense. People were watching closely, and they were demanding answers. Would justice be served for Marcus? Or would the system fail him, as it had failed so many others before him? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was certain. Marcus had sparked a movement, and the fight for justice was only just beginning. The trial of Officer John Harris had begun, and the entire nation was watching closely. After months of growing tension, the public was finally going to see whether justice would be served for Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams. Marcus, still recovering from the traumatic shooting, had become a symbol not only for the military but for the fight against racial inequality and police misconduct. His family, his fellow military officers, and countless citizens were hoping for a fair and just outcome. The courtrooms were filled with journalists, military personnel, and members of the public eager to hear the details of the case. For the first time in months, the focus shifted away from the chaos and uncertainty surrounding Marcus's recovery and back onto the question that had started it all. Did Officer Harris deserve to face the consequences of his actions? The first part of the trial was intense. The prosecution laid out a compelling argument. They presented clear evidence that Officer Harris had acted recklessly and without justification. The dashcam footage from the police car had been released to the public early in the investigation, and it was crucial to the case. It showed Marcus as calm, cooperative, and polite during the traffic stop. There was no evidence to suggest that he had provoked the officer. In fact, Marcus had even attempted to de-escalate the situation, remaining composed in the face of the officer's aggressive behavior. What became glaringly clear was that Officer Harris had made a snap judgment about Marcus based solely on his appearance. Marcus's military uniform, his calm demeanor, and the way he carried himself seemed to make Harris uncomfortable. The prosecution argued that it wasn't fear or a sense of threat that drove Harris to shoot, but rather prejudice and a deep-seated bias. The prosecutor told the court that Officer Harris had allowed his assumptions about Marcus to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had taken a life-threatening action that could have been avoided. The prosecution also revealed details about Harris's past. They carefully went over his history of complaints filed against him by civilians. There were numerous reports of Harris displaying aggression, particularly towards people of color. These were not isolated incidents. They painted a troubling picture of a man who had shown a pattern of behavior that seemed to target certain individuals based on biased assumptions. The court learned that Harris had been reprimanded a few times, but had never faced serious consequences for his actions. Instead, he had been allowed to continue his work as a police officer, never truly held accountable for his past mistakes. The more the prosecution revealed, the more it seemed clear that this case was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger issue, the issue of police officers who were allowed to continue their work despite a history of questionable actions. And with every new detail that emerged, the case against Officer Harris grew stronger. However, the defense was just as determined to make their case. Harris's legal team argued that the officer had acted in self-defense, claiming that he had feared for his life when he saw Marcus's military uniform. They suggested that Harris had been startled when Marcus didn't immediately comply with his orders, implying that the officer felt threatened and made a split-second decision in a high-stress situation. The defense tried to present Harris as a man who had served his community faithfully for years. They pointed to his record as a police officer, his commitment to his job, and his personal history of service. They painted him as someone who had never been involved in any serious misconduct until this unfortunate incident. They argued that Harris had acted out of instinct and that the shooting, while tragic, had not been a result of malice, but of a misunderstanding in a dangerous situation. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. They continued to emphasize that Harris's past behavior had been a clear indicator of his potential to misuse his power, regardless of the situation. They pointed out that his history of aggressive actions showed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. They insisted that the shooting wasn't a mistake. It was the result of a long-standing issue within the officer's behavior, one that had finally reached its breaking point. The trial lasted for several weeks, with each side presenting their case. It wasn't just a battle between two lawyers. It was a battle for justice, for truth, and for a reckoning of the systemic problems within law enforcement. But even as the case unfolded, it was clear that something larger was happening. This trial wasn't just about one officer. It was about a nationwide conversation that had been building for years, about police conduct, accountability, and the racial biases that continued to shape interactions between law enforcement and communities across the country. As the trial continued, Marcus's family remained by his side, supporting him through every step of the legal proceedings. They were hopeful but also nervous. This trial was not just about whether the officer would be convicted. It was about whether the system that allowed this officer to act with impunity would finally be held accountable. It was about whether the country would finally begin to address the larger issues that had allowed incidents like this to happen over and over again. The day of the verdict finally arrived. The court was packed with people eager to hear what would happen next. In the hours leading up to the announcement, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, mixed with a nervous tension. What would the jury decide? Would they return a guilty verdict, holding Officer Harris accountable for his actions? Or would the case end in disappointment, with the officer escaping justice once again? As the judge entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. The jury had reached a verdict. People held their breath as the judge addressed the court. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge said. Officer Harris stood, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, he looked uncertain and anxious. His defense team stood by his side, waiting for the judge to read the decision. The judge turned to the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The judge looked at the jury and then back at the courtroom. "What is the verdict?" The foreperson took a deep breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer John Harris, guilty of assault with a deadly weapon and gross misconduct in office." A wave of relief washed over Marcus's family, and there was a collective sigh in the courtroom. The decision had been made. Officer Harris would not walk away without facing consequences. The jury had sent a strong message. No one was above the law, not even those who wore a badge. Harris was convicted, and his actions had been deemed inexcusable. While the conviction brought a sense of justice, it was far from the end of the story. The trial had shone a light on the systemic issues that needed to be addressed, issues that went far beyond one officer's actions. People were now more determined than ever to push for real reform. They wanted to see changes in how police officers were trained, how they were held accountable, and how the justice system treated those who were harmed by those in positions of power. For Marcus, the conviction was a bittersweet victory. He had survived the shooting, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would stay with him forever. The road to recovery would be long, and the journey toward healing would take time. But he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice wasn't over. His story had sparked a nationwide conversation, and he was determined to continue being a voice for change. Though the trial was over, the work was just beginning. The verdict was a victory, but it was only one step in the larger battle for fairness, equality, and accountability. And for the people who had supported Marcus throughout the trial, there was hope that this was just the beginning of a much-needed transformation in how justice was served in America. The courtroom had gone quiet after the verdict. Officer John Harris was found guilty, and for many it felt like justice had finally spoken. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams sat in his wheelchair, dressed in his formal military uniform. Though his body was still healing, his spirit remained strong. He closed his eyes for a moment, not out of relief, but out of reflection. This was not just a victory for him. It was a step forward for so many others who had been unheard. Outside the courthouse, the crowd waiting had begun to cheer. Supporters held signs that read, "Justice served," "We stand with Marcus," and "Honor for all." News cameras captured every second, and reporters quickly shared the verdict with the world. It became headline news across the country. People watched from their homes, schools, offices, and even military bases. This story had touched lives in every corner of the nation. But even with the guilty verdict, Marcus knew this was not the, and it was the beginning of a much bigger journey. Now came the harder part: healing, rebuilding, and helping others understand what had happened and why it mattered so much. As Marcus left the courthouse surrounded by his legal team, family, and a few fellow officers, he was stopped by a reporter. She asked softly, "Colonel Williams, do you feel that justice was done?" He paused, then answered, "Justice isn't one decision. It's the promise that things will change for the better. Today is a start." In the days that followed, Marcus took time to rest. His injuries had healed enough for him to walk short distances, but he still carried pain, not just in his body, but deep within his heart. What had happened to him could have happened to anyone. He couldn't stop thinking about the people who hadn't received the same attention or support. He knew that many cases like his had ended in silence. That thought stayed with him every day. That's when Marcus decided he wouldn't just move on, he would speak out. He had worn the military uniform for more than 20 years, standing up for fairness, duty, and integrity. Now he would continue that mission in a new way. He began speaking at universities, military conferences, community centers, and public events. He shared his story not to gain sympathy, but to raise awareness and help build understanding between people. Marcus's message was always the same: respect, unity, and fairness. He didn't speak with anger. He didn't blame. He simply told the truth about what had happened, about what needed to change, and about how people in positions of power should always be held responsible for their actions, no matter who they are. Soon, his speeches began to gain national attention. He was invited to sit on panels about police reform, military-civilian relations, and social justice. He was asked to advise lawmakers working on policies that would increase transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Even military leaders began looking at how they could better protect service members when they were off duty. One day, Marcus received a call from the Secretary of Defense. The secretary thanked him for his bravery, not just on the battlefield, but in speaking up and guiding a conversation the nation needed. He was offered a special advisory role to help shape military training programs that addressed bias, respect, and safety for all personnel. Meanwhile, changes were beginning to happen. Police departments across the country started reviewing how they handled complaints. Some introduced new policies requiring officers to complete extra training on community relations and fair treatment. Others began working with local groups to build trust with residents. While not everything changed overnight, it was clear that the story of Marcus Williams had left a lasting mark. Back in his hometown, Marcus's name became well known, not just for what had happened to him, but for how he responded. A local school even invited him to speak to students about courage, respect, and standing up for what's right. One young student asked him, "Weren't you scared?" Marcus smiled gently and replied, "Of course I was, but being scared doesn't mean we stop doing what's right. It means we go forward anyway." The student nodded, and something in her eyes showed that his words had reached her. That was the moment Marcus truly understood the power of his story. It could inspire not just adults, but the next generation, the ones who would carry the lessons forward. As the months passed, the officer who had shot Marcus began serving his sentence. The decision had not been an easy one for the court, but it had been necessary. The message was clear: accountability matters. While some people still debated the outcome, most agreed that something important had happened, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of people who now looked at justice in a deeper way. Marcus never celebrated the officer's punishment. He wasn't seeking revenge. What mattered to him was the promise of fairness and the hope that what happened to him would not happen to someone else. He believed in giving others the chance to learn, to reflect, and to grow. And through his efforts, people began to listen more carefully, to stories, to experiences, to each other. Eventually, a national day of recognition was proposed, not just for Marcus, but for others who had faced injustice and had stood with strength. The day would be marked by community events, dialogues between police and residents, and educational programs in schools. Marcus was honored during the first celebration, not just as a victim, but as a leader who had shown how to turn pain into purpose. Back at home, life slowly returned to a new normal. Marcus enjoyed quiet evenings with his family, walks in the park, and time with his children. He remained active in his community and continued his speaking work, but he also allowed himself time to rest. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also brought growth and connection. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench watching children play, Marcus reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the moment he had been pulled over, the fear he had felt, and the pain he had endured. But he also thought about the people who had stood with him, the voices that had risen, and the hearts that had changed. He looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. Life had not gone the way he expected, but it had brought him to a place where he could truly make a difference. And for that, he was grateful. Though the road to justice had been difficult, it had also been filled with hope, unity, and purpose. Marcus had not only survived, he had helped others see a better path forward. And so the story of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams became more than a headline. It became a legacy, a living reminder that truth, courage, and compassion can light even the darkest roads, and that real change begins when we listen, learn, and stand together.